It's something that a strategic looks at and says, if I were to integrate that into my company now, I know I can make a lot more money with it than the present owners of the company. And I want that, and I want it long term. I don't want my competitors to get it. It's a strategic fit for me. So I'm willing to pay a little more if I need to, because I've fallen in love with this thing. Brand is one of those strategic drivers.
Welcome to the Legacy Branding Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Beauparlant, here to guide you through the journey of selling your business and building a personal brand that leaves a lasting impact. On the show, we'll explore real-life founder stories, expert insights, and actionable strategies to help you navigate the transition, avoid post-sale crisis, and create your impact-driven legacy brand. Whether you're thinking of selling, building to sell, or already on the other side, this podcast is your go-to resource for making your next evolution your best one yet. Let's dive in. Today on the Legacy Branding Podcast, I am very excited to welcome Paul Ormsby. He is the Senior Vice President of Operations at STS Capital Partners. He is a retired 2-star Canadian Air Force's general and a lifelong aviator. He's had a rich background in operations, experimental test flights, and strategic advisory roles. His extensive network spans government, aerospace, defense, finance, capital providers, and more, and he brings a wealth of experience to the table. He's also served as a principal advisor to the Canadian ambassador in Washington, D.C. Wow, Paul, that is quite the career you've had. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Laura. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Many conversations before, and we both have a love of flying. So we definitely bonded over that. And I wanted to really dive into this transition you took from being a 2-star Canadian Air Force's general, no big deal, and now you're the Senior VP of Operations at STS Capital Partners. And how did that background in the military, what did it teach you, and how do you bring that into the M&A world and STS Capital? I think it's such an interesting transition, and I'm sure there's many military things that you've brought to the table.
Well, thanks for the question. First of all, it's probably the most asked question I get when people meet me and they learn a little bit about my background and they find out what I'm doing now. You're working for an M&A firm? How does that happen? So I was lucky in my career because in the military, in uniform, because certainly in Canada, and I know many allied nations like the United States and England would be the same, United Kingdom, we get to experience a lot of different jobs over the courses of our careers. For instance, I did start operationally as a very young lieutenant flying and doing anti-submarine patrol work. And that's what I did for the first 8 or 9 years of my career. But I eventually got into flight testing, and that got into program management, and that got into acquisition. And I finished in Ottawa. My last posting in Canada, I was the Deputy Chief of Staff of our acquisition group, which is the group that acquires everything for the Canadian military, everything from socks and beans to F-35 jets. So a lot of the principles that we see in commercial industry or in the financial industry in terms of managing projects, leading strategic change, leading the implementation of strategic initiatives, we're doing the same thing in the military. In fact, on the corporate side of the military, we often borrow from the commercial world or the private world of business the best practices and techniques. So we're very familiar in the military with many of these processes that are being used by industry today, and we use them ourselves for our corporate planning, our business planning, our strategic planning inside the military. So to answer your question about how I ended up with STS, when I was considering retiring, a very good friend of mine who was also retiring from the military had just been hired by STS. And he was also a very senior officer in the military too. And he was brought in to help oversee the expansion of STS because coming out of COVID, our founder, Rob Follows, correctly identified the fact that M&A would be very hot coming out of COVID. So he wanted to grow the company. So Sean Friday, my friend, was brought in, and eventually Sean has now become the CEO of the company. But prior to that, Sean contacted me and said, hey, Paul, I know you're thinking about retiring as well, and I could really use your help on the corporate side, managing the growth and the programs that we want to bring in and the strategic changes that we want to bring in. Would you be interested in doing it? And we'll teach you about the business as well of M&A and how we do what STS specifically does, which is quite niche in and of itself. So that sounded very interesting to me. And I took the challenge and I took the offer, and here I am 2.5 years later. and very happy to be at STS. It's a wonderful company. The experience has been great. My military experience has translated 100% into the role here. Of course, I've learned new things about M&A while in this job, but very close similarities between what I had done in the military and what is happening here at STS.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that. I think it's always
No.
fascinating to hear where people started and then where they end up. And I love that you're also kind of redefining retirement for yourself, that you're in your third act, basically.
I've retired from the military, but I haven't retired from life. So there's still more to do.
Exactly. I feel like we've had that conversation before. I love it. So this podcast is about branding, and I call it legacy branding. That's the work that we do here at Lab Creative. So, and I know we've talked about this before, but I'd love for you to share how important a business's brand is in the sales process. And do you have any stories you could share? And what role does that play in determining the value of a business?
So first, let me just say that brand is extremely important from our perspective when we're looking at a company. And we like to think of it in the context of the drivers of strategic value. That's a term that we often use, and you'll see it in our literature, and you'll see it if you were a client of ours, you would hear us use that term. And we also tie that with another phrase we often use, which is called Rembrandt's in the attic. And if I could just maybe tell that anecdote very quickly, I'll get to the question about brand. We often speak with potential clients and we ask them, what's the Rembrandt in the attic of your company? What's that special thing that you've got that if you had a house and you were selling everything in the house and it came with everything in it and there's artwork up in the attic and there's a Rembrandt in there, if someone were to recognize the value of that, they're probably going to pay you more for it compared to the other ones on the street because they see the extra value that one item or a series of items like that bring to your business. The anecdote's a bit longer than that. I won't go into it all here, but essentially it's a driver of strategic value. It's something that a strategic looks at and says, if I were to integrate that into my company now, I know I can make a lot more money with it than the present owners of the company. And I want that, and I want it long term. I don't want my competitors to get it. It's a strategic fit for me. So I'm willing to pay a little more if I need to, because I've fallen in love with this thing. Brand is one of those strategic drivers. It has all the characteristics that strategic buyers are looking for. A brand is something, when it's done well, it commands greater trust and loyalty from the customers. It can lead to more consistent revenue streams. Strategic buyers are very interested in that. It can provide that competitive advantage. It makes it easier to attract and retain the customers. That can result in higher profit margins. And again, a strategic acquirer is looking for that. There's the growth potential. There's the reduced risk in the eyes of the consumer, where if it's a well-recognized brand like Volvo in terms of car safety, people associate that with Volvo. That is a branded item. It's safety characteristics. So people have an extra bit of trust, which may affect their buying decision. And then, of course, there's the brand equity, that intangible asset that a brand has, which often can command a higher price. So interestingly, we are working with a client right now that's actually relatively small in terms of the defense industry, but it is a defense company. And we were working through our strategies on how we were going to get this company in front of larger tier one players like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, et cetera. And we actually came to the decision that our best strategy was the brand. This was a trusted company, a very highly successful and talented engineers from a pool of engineers, which is very, very small in this specific field. So it didn't have a lot of sales yet, but it had amazing intellectual properties and inventions that it had created that the defense industry and certain governments were looking for. They just hadn't won the big contracts yet to deliver 1,000 of these things. That's coming. We know that's coming. But the owners decided it was time to sell. So we've sold that business, or we're in the process of selling it based on brand. People know the owner. People know the name of the company. They know the quality. They know the fact that company is consistently winning the R&D contracts from the government to develop these new things. And they recognize it right away. And the strategic buyer is going to look at that and say, you know what, that's a perfect fit for me.
It's like that idea of a turnkey. You buy a house, and does it need a gut reno? Or is it like you turn the key, you walk in and you put in your furniture and you're done? And that's kind of what having a great brand does for somebody who's buying, is they're like, I can just buy this business and we can just get started.
Correct. Because the number one thing in the mind of a strategic buyer is it a strategic fit? Does it fit a hole that I've got that I need to fill? And I don't want to maybe recreate it from scratch. I'll just buy one and bring it in. Or I'm doing this now, and this is a perfect sister company to bring in beside it. And when they see that, they have to have it. And again, brand is one of many keys that strategic buyers look at. But in this particular case, it was the key.
Okay, so what are the different types of buyers?
So generally, we divide them into two. There's a series of financial buyers, which typically is private equity, venture capital, specialized funds that are set up to sponsor investments and so on. And then there are the strategics. It's never black and white. There are some private equity companies that are very strategically minded, and many of them actually fund strategic players in the industry. But generally speaking, financials. And so what's a strategic? A strategic is normally the tier one players that you'd be thinking of in any industry. So Johnson & Johnson, 3M, Lockheed Martin, as I mentioned, Unisys, Cisco, Apple. And there are a number of other companies that are in those tiers that most people never heard of, but they are very, very big players globally. So large operators, they tend to have global operations. They're very well funded, very well resourced in terms of people and money on the balance sheets. Their view of acquiring a company is something that they're going to have for long term. They're going to own that company for 25, 30 years. They're going to integrate it. They're going to bring to bear on it their own resources, which are enormous, to help with the marketing, to help with the branding, to help with the product development, and maybe manufacturing at a much lower cost than the original owners are doing it. And they're willing to pay high multiples for that because they know they're going to make even more multiple on it when they get the product or the product lines into production with them. The classic example of that is our founder, Rob Follows. He sold his company for 27 times its earnings to a strategic buyer. He found out later that that company would have paid him 100 times its earnings, and which is extraordinary. Wow. And he went to the owner of the company, he said, whom he knew personally, and he said, why would you ever pay 100 times earnings for a company? And he said, Rob, the answer is really easy, because I know I can make 300 times. So that's how a strategic buyer thinks. A financial buyer, typically their playbook is very different. They're very good at what they do, and there are some very good companies out there in this area, but typically their playbook is, we're going to buy low your company today, and then we're going to sell it high later, maybe in 3 or 4 or 5 years. So that's a very typical private equity, venture capital kind of strategy. And often they will have the owners stay on for that period, and they'll say, well, we're going to give you one bite of the apple first when we buy the company from you, but we're only going to give you, say, 80% of the total price. You work for us for 3 years, 4 years perhaps, whatever that time frame may be. And then we're going to sell it higher, and you'll get a second bite of the apple, and then we're done. We move on. That's typically a financial buyer playbook. They're not long-term. They're not thinking about integrating it into a longer or larger entity or enterprise. It's take it, turn it, and sell it. Problem with that is when it goes wrong, it can go wrong very badly. That extra second bite may never happen if the company doesn't perform well. And we often find that owners who sell to a financial buyer in this regard, they often have, I shouldn't say often, I don't want to overstate it, but on occasion, there are bad experiences because they no longer control the company, but they're in the company and they're watching the company degrade over time. And the company doesn't normally perform as well as it was performing. And then there's this often unfortunate outcome where that second bite of the apple doesn't materialize the way it was promised. So a strategic buyer tends to pay cash upfront for the entire company on day one, and then the owners move on. So that's what we specialize in, is finding strategic buyers for our clients.
That's really also about culture fit and relationships. And there's a transaction for sure. It's not just about the transaction.
In fact, we tell them it's not a transaction, it's a journey. And you have to be able to tell us what you're looking for in that journey so we can get it for you. STS actually stands for selling to strategics. So that's our niche.
What do you find is the most challenging aspect of selling a business that founders might overlook as they're thinking about it?
I think the number one thing that owners are not thinking of is actually establishing a vision of the exit that they want, a vision of the outcomes that they're looking for professionally and personally. It's probably the most important thing a business owner can do after the owner has decided that he or she wants to exit the business. If we work with a client, we spend a lot of time up front trying to understand what that vision is. Often people will say, well, I want a deal that looks like this and that. I want the time frame to be that, X, Y, Z, or otherwise. And those are really kind of deal dynamics. They're not actually outcome. We need them to tell us what their vision is in terms of outcomes, because if they can articulate that, then we can get alignment with them and they can get alignment with all the stakeholders that are important to making the deal a success. So we often use techniques to collect this information from them. For instance, open-ended questions. We'll often ask them, if you could wave a magic wand, what would be the ideal outcome for you? What are the essential things you must have from the exit? And what are the desirable things that are the nice to have things from the exit? What are the goalposts you see for the time? What are the goalposts you see for the minimum price and the deal price if you could get it? What are you thinking about your life looking like in 2 years after the exit, 5 years after the exit, and 10 years after the exit? What about all the stakeholders who are involved in the process? What about your management team? What about all your employees? What do you think are their interests, and how do you want to protect those interests? So this is very, very important for us to understand and work with the owner to articulate that, because that's going to be our roadmap when we go through the process of selling. And we'll often return to that when we're working with a client, when offers start to come in, or if maybe something we didn't expect come in. For instance, we may be thinking this company wants to be sold by the owner, but another company may come in and say, I don't want to buy it, but I want to partner with it. Well, what would that look like? Does it meet these needs? Does it meet these requirements of the vision? So that vision exercise that we do is critical, and we'll often come to it over and over again. A number of years ago, our founder was working directly with the client, and he had gone through this exercise with the company, and it was two owners, and both owners happened to be men. They owned 50-50 in the company. So each one had equal voting rights for major decisions about buying, selling, whatever they wanted to do. So when they came to us initially, they said, we would be extremely happy if you could get us $1 for our company. We'll walk away. We're done. So Rob said, okay, great. So STS took them to market. And after a number of offers, we were able to get them an offer of $258 million.
Okay.
So $208 million over what they were looking for. So they accepted the offer in principle. The company that was acquiring them sent a private jet to go pick up the two partners and fly them to their headquarters where they could have the final negotiations, papers would be signed. On the way up in the jet, they started to have a conversation about, wow, this is great. Look, if they can afford this, they can probably afford more. And so they got off the jet, went into the conference room, and more or less told the acquiring company, we want you to raise the bid. We're not going to accept your $258 million. And of course, Rob, STS, was like, oh, hang on a second here, gentlemen. But you said you were going to be happy with 50 million. You've got a 258 million offer on the table, and you should take it. And one partner wanted to take it, and one partner didn't want to take it, wanted more. So that partner blocked the deal going through. The acquiring company said, well, thank you very much. We're not paying you another cent. The jet will take you home. Have a nice day. And they got off the jet and they lost that deal. And wouldn't you know it, a quarter later, their business started to decline. Hard times, a lot of reasons for it, but it took them almost 3 years to get back to the point where they were when they had the 258 million offer. So there was a classic case of them starting out with a vision, but then not sticking with it, and it cost them a lot of money. So that's why we always say the vision is the most important thing, the outcomes. What are the outcomes that you're looking for? The rest of it is all just mechanics, preparing marketing material, having meetings, and so on. But the owners have to have an idea in their head so they know when they're done. They know when they've achieved what they want to achieve. And not just, oh, okay, more, because it can have a negative outcome.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people like the idea of selling. I think post-COVID, there's lots of people that are like ready to sell. They got burnt out. They're like, okay, I'm ready to move on, do something different. Yeah. But they're not necessarily prepared for the what's next, the emotional side of it. And that's what I see in my work is I end up helping a lot of founders on their personal brand or that thing that they're going to do after they've sold their business. And it usually comes with an existential crisis of identity because they've exited and they're like, I got the sale, I made all the money, and you're like, and now what? And who am I? Yeah. And I love that you're helping them create this vision that isn't just about dollars and cents. It's also about what is the vision you have for your life after.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how many, they're just so busy running the business, right? They're successful and that's all they've ever done in many cases. They've run this business for 40 years. It's the most valuable thing they've ever owned in their entire life. And it's a big step for them. But we also know that if we can get them to articulate, hey, in 2 years, I'm going to be okay for money, but I want to invest in businesses, not own them. I want to be on boards and be a mentor, or I want to work with my church, or I want to so on and so on. Often when we push them in that direction, it's the first time anybody's pushed them in that direction to think about that.
Exactly. And in some ways, this is a big reason why I've started the podcast and I focused so much on helping people build their legacy brand. And so when I tell people we help founders who want to position their business to sell it and then build a personal brand for their next evolution, they're like, oh, or people who've come to me years after they've sold and they've gone through that roller coaster and said, I wish I knew you sooner. And so I think between what you're doing and what I'm doing, we're kind of tackling it from the two ends of the spectrum and really helping them through not just the sale and the what's next, but the emotions that come with it.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, we often encourage owners to build what we call an exit team. It's not just a sell-side advisor like STS, which is what we are. We advise on the sell side when you want to sell your company. But you need a team to help you. And that includes everything from lawyers, tax accountants. If you're spiritual, it may be a pastor, or a minister, or a priest. But your family is a big part of it. Your close friends and confidants. It's a roller coaster. It's an emotional roller coaster, and you need help articulating the vision to get through the process and then get to the next stage.
I love that. That was going to be my question, was how do they deal with the emotions? But you're guiding them. You're actually advising them to have all those people on their team so that they can rely on them.
Yeah. A lot of business owners already have people like you, or they're working with a business coach that they've trusted for many years. So we often meet those coaches as well, but we know the clients having sort of a sidebar conversation with them. We don't always see, but that's healthy. That's good. They need somewhere to go to on the bad days as well, to get some advice and counsel and have a coffee with somebody. We do what we can to manage the process as well, because we're trying to relieve the business owner of all the work required to sell the business. We don't introduce the owners to potential buyers until almost the 11th hour. We do all the work on his behalf or her behalf. We have all the meetings. We handle all the meetings. We handle the negotiations so they can run the business. But still, they're always eye down on the business, but one eye up. Hey, how's it going? What can I do? How are we? How come it hasn't sold yet? Patience. It'll happen. So.
Yeah, I'm sure it's entrepreneurs. I don't know about everybody, but I'm not necessarily known for my patience. So.
Well, they're doers, right? They're doers, and they're outcomes focused for sure.
So if you could give founders one piece of advice, if they're thinking about selling their business, what would that be?
I would say consider the options before you for acquirers, and not just because we're in the strategic business, finding strategic buyers, but don't get locked into the idea you have to sell to private equity. Don't get locked into the idea you have to sell to venture capital. There are a lot of great companies out there that will acquire your company at a very good price. Learn about that process. Learn about strategic buyers and how they work. Talk to sell-side advisors, talk to mentors, because honestly, much of the activity in many of the industries is actually acquisition by strategic buyers. A lot of people think it's private equity, but it's not always the case. So that's the first thing, would be educate yourself on that. See if that is something that you're interested in pursuing. It will probably take a bit longer time to do that, because these bigger companies move at a slower pace. Some of them are getting 20, 30 proposals a week to look at from companies that are representing companies for sale. So it takes a bit of time. Private equity can move a little faster, but there are pitfalls to it as well, or financial buyers, I should say. Not private equity. But educate yourself there. Second thing I would say would be start now. Even if you're thinking about selling in 5 years, start thinking about what you need to get ready to go to market. Are the financials in order? Do you have a full-time CFO? Do you have a strong management team? Is everybody on the management team aligned with the idea of selling? What would it take to get them aligned if they're not? If you've got a CFO who's, just as an example, could be a chief marketing officer with a significant equity stake in the company, is that person aligned with the idea of selling? And if they're not, what would a deal look like to make them aligned? How would that work? What about your employees? We often hear from owners that say, look, last thing I want, because I'm going to stay in this town when I sell, last thing I want is go to the grocery store and someone poke me in the chest saying, well, you got a great deal on the exit, but the rest of us are all in trouble now. The company from whoever bought it is running it into the ground. So thanks for nothing. They feel very strongly about these things. So they need to think through those ideas as well. But a good business with good revenues, good management team, good products, good pipeline, work on those things. That's what attracts a strategic buyer, because a strategic wants to know, if I buy that, is it going to move the needle for me next quarter? on my quarterly report when I have to tell my shareholders what we're doing on the profit and loss. That would be my
Yeah, thanks for that.
yeah.
So I want to ask you one last question. And obviously, the name
Sure.
of the podcast is Legacy Branding. So I want to know, what does legacy mean to you, Paul?
I'll actually tell you what it means. I lied a little bit when I said STS stands for selling to strategics. It actually stands for success to significance by selling to strategics. And let me tell you what that means. Again, Rob, our founder, is very philanthropically minded. When he sold his company back in the 90s for that 27 times its earnings, first thing he did was set up a charity in Toronto, which is called UltraVest, which brings together, experienced C-suite people, teaches them how to be good board members, and matches them up with nonprofits and like causes in the area to make them more effective and more efficient. We brought that idea into STS, where success to significance refers to the fact that as an entrepreneur, you've been successful. Now think about doing something significant for you, for the world, maybe for the next generation. We can't force people to do anything, of course, but we encourage them to think about maybe setting up a new charity or donating to a charity of their choice, because they've had this newfound wealth, they've had this giant liquidity event, and maybe a donation here would be something for altruistic reasons that you want to be thinking about. Also, anyone at STS, if they earn any fees from working on any of the mandates or deals with our clients, if any of our people donate to a registered charity, STS matches it up to 100%. And we also pay a referral fee if someone were to, one of our advisors, who are a prime source of referrals, if they call us up and they refer in a company, a nice warm introduction, and we end up selling that company, we pay a thank you fee to the advisor. And if the advisor donates any portion of that to a charity, we match that up to 100% as well. And that fee is up to $250 for a referral. So that could be a $500,000 donation to a charity right there. So that is success to significance by selling to strategics. That's STS. And we are on the path to raising $1 billion and more in philanthropic capital that way through M&A. And as far as I know, we're the only ones doing that, at least by this method. And we're very proud of that. It's part of our heritage.
I love that. There's a reason why we're so aligned, Paul, and why I always enjoy our conversations, because to me, it is like, what is the impact we are doing while we're here? And it is for us, for our families, for the world, for our clients, teams. It isn't just about who can make the most money. Well, money is important. Right. It's part of the equation, but it's not to the detriment of others, and that it allows you, your wealth allows you to have a greater impact, a variety of different ways. Right. And so I think that's a beautiful gift that you're giving to the world.
Well, thank you. We're very proud of that. And we want to spread the word. And we hope other companies do something similar. And it's not a competition, but we do think we owe it to the world to make it a better place, no matter who we are, how much money we do or don't have.
So how can people learn more about STS Capital and connect with you?
Well, the easiest way would be through our website, capital.com. And we do have a form on the site where people could reach out and submit requests for information, or even if they wanted to find out more about selling their company. I'd be very happy to have a more personal conversation with people. I think you've got my email address. I'd be happy to share that through you, Laura. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. Not too many Paul Ormsbys around. I am in Barbados, so look for the guy, Paul Ormsby in Barbados.
I will make sure we include all of those links, Paul. And I love it. You're living your best life and doing amazing work. So thank you. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Oh, thanks, Laura. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into the Legacy Branding Podcast. I hope today's episode has inspired and empowered you on your journey to building a brand that truly matters. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other founders who you think would benefit from listening. And if you're ready to take the next step in building your legacy brand, visit our website, labcreative.ca, to learn more and book a call. Don't forget to join us next time for more conversations that will help you navigate your transition and create your legacy. Until then, I'm Laura Beauparlant.